We'll do that one right after Mike. What will you do with the time you have left? With our free time the past few nights, KP and I have been watching a television show from the BBC called Ghosts. If you're not familiar with this show, it is a lovely British show about a couple who finds themselves owners of a new old manor that the locals say is haunted. And the two young people in the couple don't believe it, and then the woman has an encounter with a ghost and receives a brain injury. She's in a coma for a couple of weeks, and when she comes to, she finds she can see the ghosts who are in the house. And the ghosts are a comical lot. They are going about trying to live their ghostly lives, and it's a wonderful look at death and afterlife. It is hilarious and wholesome. It talks about souls, about love, about grief, and about the problems of communication that both the living and the dead seem to have. And reflecting for today's service, a lot of us come into this and say, why are we talking about death here at church? What's going on? And I felt the same way. But I want to offer a few framing reasons for why we're talking about this today, because I believe that church is the place that you should have the hard conversations in life. If you cannot talk about death here, where can you talk about it? It's not exactly a conversation you might have on the train or at a dinner party or by the swimming pool, for example. That we shouldn't just talk about death when we come for memorials and funerals, not just about other people's deaths, but about our own mortality as well. UU theologian and minister Forrest Church, of beloved memory, used to say that religion comes out of the dual reality of being alive and having to die. That everything could be viewed through those two lenses, that death is what gives life meaning. What will you do with the time you have left? And death is what gives life meaning, but the flip side of that is it also puts a lot of pressure on us to do something with life. So we're going to look at both sides of those over the next few weeks, dying and living. Today is about living and dying, and next week is about living and dying. So we'll get a lot of that. Secondly, UUs actually have a theological and historical reputation for being the leaders in thinking and talking about death. Historian Susan Ritchie talks about Mount Auburn Cemetery in the Boston area and how it shows the march through history of how folks from the Puritan ancestors viewed death based on what the tombstones look like and what the messages are. That at first there is a real disdain and fear. The skull and crossbones becomes a symbol of death, something to be avoided at all costs. And then, throughout time, as the Unitarians and Universalists start to grow in influence in the Boston area, the tombstones start to have different images. Angels, crosses, circles, weeping willows, flowers. That the theology around death is transformed by the progressive liberal people of the day. So I also feel like we kind of have a responsibility to carry that mantle forward. And lastly, it's because these are the realest conversations we can have. The most human of conversations, perhaps. When I was a hospital chaplain in my life before, still in this life, not in a past life, which we'll also talk about today. When I would visit folks who are in the ICU and who are able to communicate, oftentimes we'd start off talking about the simple things, the weather and the food and pain. But we would end up talking about regrets, about love left unspoken, things left unsaid, about what heaven looks like, about whether there is heaven at all, about what it feels like to die, whether it hurts or whether it is relief, what it is like to live in a body that is failing from age, from disease, or from trauma. These are the most holy conversations I think we can have as people. So that's the goal for today and for next week. To not be scary or morbid, not to hide it away in the skull and crossbones, but to be real and to be honest and courageous. Maybe to be a little funny. And to try and develop our own theology around death. I was taught that if we treat death like the schoolyard bully, someone to stand up for yourself, to not back down, treat him with kindness. If we can do that, then death doesn't stand a chance of being as scary. So we're going to talk. And you're never supposed to start sermons like this, but we do. The Webster definition of death has actually changed a lot over the centuries. For a long time, folks understood death as the separation of the soul from the body. It was the most basic definition. Doctors were not really involved in that process, as you can imagine, because it was talking about the soul. It was often the village holy person, the priest, the shaman, for example, who identified that death was separation of the soul from the body. And I think even now that's still a pretty good definition, depending on what you believe about souls, whether or not you think they're eternal. I think it's still a pretty good definition when we talk about death in a clinical setting, right? Either it's when someone's soul separates or when consciousness is lost, someone's identity, someone's personhood is no longer there in their physical body. The you-ness or the me-ness we talk about. The clinical definition today is something called brain death, which is often the cause of death for most people. It's when the brain starts to shut down slowly, one region at a time, until there's no function left. As we said, that can happen from different causes, but there are only a few, right? There's something that could be accidental, right? We might die from an accidental drowning, some kind of car wreck, for example. Usually that's traumatic. Might die from some intentional injury that is always traumatic. Homicide, suicide. Or from disease. Those are really the three categories for those who like categories. It was helpful for me in taking a class on death and dying when I was a senior in seminary. I was also planning my wedding and getting ready to graduate. And so I would spend my mornings learning about the dying process and about palliative care and living wills and advance directives. And then I would go home and I would write about my vows that we were going to take for the rest of our lives until death does us part. And there was something incredibly holistic about all of that. Some of us have been in the room with folks who are dying. Some of us haven't. But it is something that we're all going to experience. So when we talk about the dying process, when the soul leaves the body is a big theological question. But the actual physical process is almost always the same. Folks who go on to live in hospitals and die in hospitals receive care and receive treatment for their symptoms. And oftentimes the focus is either a cure for the accident, for the trauma, for the disease, or the treatment is about quality of life. And we want to talk about both of those. I often share that at the end of our lives, your body goes through a lot of different changes. As we age, or as we reach our end, we might start to sleep more, to consume less, to breathe less and less often. The cells in our bodies start to fail at different rates. And no matter what age we are, you could say that our cells are starting to fail at different rates even now. Our eyes wear out, it gets harder to hear. We start to stoop in our posture. But at the end, your brain is usually the last thing to go. Whether that's where your consciousness is or your soul is. Your brain survives 4 to 6 minutes after we stop breathing or our heart stops beating, pumping blood and oxygen to the rest of our body. It can be scary. It can be off-putting. And folks who have had near-death experiences, NDEs, who have found a way to reverse death, often seem to agree that the process is not painful. And I find a lot of comfort in this. People who've had near-death experiences describe these common characteristics: a feeling of peace and well-being, a sense of separation from the physical body, and oftentimes a sensation of walking through darkness to enter light. And neurobiologists and psychologists have come up with all different theories for what that feeling is. The release of endorphins at the very end. It often leads to moments of clarity or lucidity for those who are dying, which is a wonderful gift to those who are gathered. And it can be so heartbreaking to have someone who's been sick for a long time and hasn't been able to communicate, and then all of a sudden they will wake up and know who you are and be able to communicate so clearly. And you think, oh, we're on the cure stage. But it is not a cure. It is a parting gift. Just like the ghosts in the show that we were watching who have trouble communicating with those who are alive, I take so much comfort in this. And the one last chance to say what you want to say, to hear and be heard, to love and be loved. But not everyone gets that chance, right? Statistics say that 80% of people want to die at home, and 20% of people do. 80% of people want to die at home, and 20% of people do. And oftentimes, if we get to live to be that old, like Janet's father, or if we don't have some kind of traumatic injury or accidental death, either way, at some point it is too late to communicate what you want people to know, what you want to happen to you if you have to go into the hospital, what you want done with your body afterwards, what your religious traditions are. So unless you become a ghost, like in the show, and you find a way to communicate, although even in that show, the whole crux of the argument is they have a really hard time communicating with the living. They want to express themselves and they can't figure out how. Now is the time to think about, while we've got our wits about us, no matter where we are in the failing body stage, what do we want to communicate to our family, to our friends, to our community? So after this service, I want to talk with folks who want to ask questions about what we call advanced directives, or sometimes called living wills, and about the pulsed form. So if you've never heard of a living will or an advanced directive, you have the quick and dirty version here. I was taught that a living will is your basic Google Doc that says, this is what I want done. It's just that someone knows, right? And an advanced directive is the legal thing that you can give to a hospital, to a hospice center, to someone to say, this is this person's legal wishes. This is what their intentions are. Sometimes it's notarized. I don't know if it needs to be notarized here in Pennsylvania. I'll look into that. But it also includes giving someone the power to make medical decisions for you, the medical power of attorney. So these legal documents, friends, I cannot impress this upon you enough. As a former hospital chaplain and as your minister, they are so helpful. They're so helpful. And it's hard to think about. I had to write mine while I was writing my wedding vows. Very trippy. But now is the time to think about what you want to communicate, to exercise your autonomy, your consciousness, your spirit, your soul, to communicate, communicate, communicate. Not in fear of death, but in partnership with death. So on these pulsed forms, the prescription in order for life-saving treatment, Depending on where we are, what our bodies are like, we may want to sign up to not be resuscitated if our heart stops, or to not be intubated with a breathing tube if our lungs stop. These are extraordinary life-saving measures, they call them, and they will save you most of the time. They will save you. They will prevent death. You can keep someone's heart beating and keep someone's lungs breathing for a long, long time. But if your consciousness is gone, if your brain has died, if your spirit has left, if you're not really there, it's too late to communicate. And the people who have been resuscitated and been intubated can tell you it is not fun. It is not fun. This is a decision to talk about with your family, with your medical power of attorney, to communicate. When you want to be cured, and when you are ready to move towards a hospice care style of medicine, what we call palliative care, which is not trying to cure a disease or to heal the injury or the trauma, but is moving to symptom management, to quality of life. And a lot of times when people hear the word hospice or palliative care, they think about it as giving up. I don't want to give up, right? I want to keep fighting. And that's wonderful. But we often say that palliative care is not giving up. And sometimes people with terminal diseases go on palliative care and they keep on living. Case in point, Shirley Green, for those who knew Shirley. Shirley and I had the conversation 2 years ago when she went into the hospital. And she started receiving palliative care every once in a while and went to her assisted living place and lived for 2 more years through a global pandemic. Quality of life, quality of consciousness, quality of being ourself for as long as possible. I think that's part of the dying process that I want to embrace. When do I want to move to symptom management? What do I want for pain relief? For me, the feeling, I'm very claustrophobic, and so the idea of not being able to breathe, that's the worst thing in the world for me. So that's what I have written in my form. Like, whatever it takes to keep me feel like I'm breathing, do that. I don't want to feel out of breath. But the feeling of discomfort and unease, right, is real, especially for our African American community that has so many traumas, generational from the U.S. healthcare system. That hospice care and emergency care, it can be really tough to have these conversations. 80% of folks want to die at home and only 20% do. That's the reality. So, what do we do as UUs? I'm not asking you to go and sign up for palliative care right now, no matter where you are in your health journey. I'm not asking you to give up or to stop fighting, because what we do as UUs, right? We are loyal to life. We try to make the world a better place, to fight against death-dealing policies and diseases. But fighting against death itself, right? I've changed my tune on this. I think going from thinking about avoiding death to fighting death, trying to escape death at every turn. What would it be like to accept death as part of life, to greet death as part of life, to dance with death as a partner, as my beloved professor of death and dying said? As our bodies slow down, as our heart begins to slow, the brain's neurons keep motoring away for as long as possible, trying to give that one last gift of consciousness and communication before we go on to the great journey of the cosmos. What happens to our bodies is also cultural and religious. Orthodox Jewish folks bury their people on the same day. Mainline Christian folks, perhaps within the week. Buddhists believe that consciousness stays in the body for 3 days. Hindus are cremated, releasing the soul into the cycle. Our Roman Catholic siblings frown on cremation, but they're coming around. And you sometimes wait a long, long time to have memorial services. There's no one right answer, is the point, for each one of us. But I hope you will think about your answer today to communicate with your loved ones and your family and friends here and now. Because while I love this BBC show, Ghosts, I'm not entirely convinced. We don't know for sure what happens to us after we die. Whether we go to the pearly gates in the sky, to quote the comedian Jim Gaffigan, what does heaven need gates? What kind of neighborhood is heaven in that it needs gates? Whether we go to the plains of Valhalla to await Ragnarok, sail to the field of rushes past the gates of Osiris, move on to the oasis of paradise to be greeted by our family and friends, whether we slip back into a new body to try again for enlightenment, whether we reach enlightenment and bask with the Buddha, or if we simply go on to that great dark space of rest, to fall asleep for the deepest and longest of naps. As a new parent, I can tell you some days, that sounds pretty good. No, friends, we cannot know for sure. And those who do know aren't telling. Ghosts don't communicate well if the BBC is to be believed. But we do know that we must die, that to be human is to be alive and to have to die. And to make life meaningful, we have to live as these humans, fragile and frail, broken and restored, promise-making, promise-breaking, finite and infinite, all at once. It is a lot to lose in death, but it is a lot to have in life. A quote here from an anonymous writer: "Death isn't an adversary we can conquer or a battle that is to be won. It is a natural part of life that occurs sooner or later because our bodies weren't made to last forever." And death is a mysterious business, after all. A mystery, a mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. For me, the best part of mystery shows like Ghost or mystery novels is reading through, experiencing, and tracking the clues, and taking notes, comparing theories with my friends, and then that feeling of euphoria, the eureka moment at the end when you figure it out. I know who and when and where. The mystery revealed. That moment of euphoria. Perhaps just like when our brain floods our body with endorphins at the very end. The acknowledgement that it is our time to die. And this is the gift. One last grasp of experience and consciousness to communicate, to love and be loved. What a gift. And I say the gift that we can give to the living now, before we're ghosts, is to communicate, to write your living will down, to fill out an advance directive, to have it filed somewhere. Maybe give a copy to your minister. Know who is your medical power of attorney. Keep it updated. Because the knowledge of our wishes, to share from our consciousness, our spirit, our soul, before we pass away, to make it clear what we want out of death. That is our story. Progressive theology that leads to love. And to give that gift to your loved ones, because they'll have a lot else to deal with in trying to decide what you want done with your body or what hymns you want at your funeral. That's just one more thing to deal with. That is a story about love, and a story about grief, and a story about communication. So may we live now until we die, And when we die, may we die with the knowledge that we have lived and loved and communicated it well, in written legal form, in words said, in hugs given. What will you do with the time you have left? May it be so. Amen.